Hello and welcome back to HEMA Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the gold medal match from the Oxford Open, which happened in Wessex, and it is going to be between Mark Wilkie and Duncan McLaren. So this was a pretty cool fight, a gold medal match, and between one person that I've heard of before, Duncan, and one person that I hadn't personally, Mark. And it was a pretty interesting fight with a lot of, I would say, old school style longsword tactics, or maybe I'm just saying that because Mark had some Koenigs on. But either way, a really fun match to watch and a really good one to break down. So for our first exchange, both fighters come out of the gate a little bit jumpy. They're using a lot of footwork to try to basically find out what their opponent is going to do, and I think inadvertently start matching each other's tempo. This is not a thing that they do for the rest of the fight, so I'll chalk it up to first round anxiety, I guess. But after which they both started bouncing around a little bit. Duncan, on the right here, throws a flat hand cut, which I believe was really just meant to bait a response. As you can see, the cut wasn't ever really in range. I think it was just going through a bit of a motion so that Mark would attempt to throw that ballistic thrust, which he would be able to parry. Now, what happens after that is that Mark shoulders his guard, basically putting it up into a Vom-Tog position, and starts walking forward, and this provokes an extremely defensive stance from Duncan. He goes up into a left-hanging parry and stays there and waits for Mark to throw his attack, which he does. Now, one thing I want to point out is that this hanging parry from Duncan is not quite perfect. You can actually see it pretty nicely from the footage, but there's a little triangle here made by the L shape from the crossguard and the blade where you can just see a little bit of his mask sticking out. And what that means is that his hanging parry just needed to be like 1 inch higher and 1 inch further to the left in order to be completely safe. And the reason this is important is because when you're holding a defensive position, what you're essentially saying is that I'm going to wait for an attack to be thrown at this quadrant, and the second I feel it hit my blade, I'm going to pull off and throw my counterattack. If your defensive option is not 100% perfectly covered, what that essentially means is that you're going to wait for that attack to come in, and it's just going to hit you. And while I can't really tell from the footage here, it does look like Mark might have gotten a little chunk of mask on his initial attack for this exact reason. However, regardless of what the, intention was, immediately upon feeling that pressure on his guard, Duncan pulls off and throws a low right Zverkow on his opposite side, attempting to throw a good counterattack. It does manage to hit Mark in the arms, but at the exact same time, Mark pulls off for himself and throws a big cut around toward the shoulder of Duncan. And in the opinion of the judges, both of these land. And it definitely seems like that's true. However, one thing I want to point out here is that especially when you're trying to throw a low right Zverkow, it is extremely important that you get your hands over your head, because if you don't, this is exactly what happens. Remember that every time you finish a Zverkow cut or any kind of low cut, the position you end up in now becomes the hanging guard that needs to keep you safe from an afterblow. And similar to the hanging guard that Duncan had in the initial exchange, he needs to get them just a little bit higher and a little bit more off to the side if he's going to rely on them to keep him safe from afterblows or even initial cuts. Now, the next exchange is a very confusing one and also a very quick one. Duncan moves into measure, basically trying to probe out a bit of a response. Mark simply continues to walk forward, at which point Duncan throws a kind of middle-level hand strike that does appear to hit Mark immediately in the gloves. However, at the exact same time as Mark is trying to parry this attack, Duncan doesn't quite get out of range fast enough, and the result is a little weird. Mark, who is continuing to walk forward, parries, or at least tries to parry, this blow off to his left side, which inadvertently puts his tip online. As he's continuing to walk forward, he almost inadvertently walks his point directly into the throat of Duncan, at which point, realizing what he's done, just extends his arms forward and finishes that thrust. The judges called this a strike to the hands with a thrust to the face with afterblow, and I definitely can't argue with that. But if you're wondering why this was so bizarre of an exchange, I think a lot of it had to do with the kind of mismatch of expectations that each fighter had from their opponent. Mark was walking forward expecting Duncan to just hold up a parry like he had done before, and I think Duncan threw that hand shot, rather intelligently so, to try to capitalize on the fact that Mark was walking into measure without really much of a defense, but only found that he was going to continue to walk through that attack and put something of his own in there. I think Duncan kind of expected that they were going to stay at a more safe range. He was going to be able to get that hand snipe and walk out of the way, only to find that Mark's forward momentum just completely eliminated that gap, and they both had a little moment of confusion where neither one really knew what was going on because something seemed to have happened, and then they both kind of made a split decision afterwards to just try to do something else. For the next exchange, we get a perfect demonstration of one of my favorite techniques, the flat shield how, and particularly why it is so effective in this particular situation. So Mark is walking forward. He is basically signaling to his opponent that he is going to try to either throw a cut or throw a shield how, given that he keeps shouldering his blade with his thumb on the flat. And Duncan prepares his own thrust. Now, the thing about the flat shield how is that it's very, very good at setting off things that come in that linear fashion. And the reason for that is that when you try to throw the short edge down, you essentially eliminate the width of the blade as a factor for pushing things offline, and it also makes it a little bit easier to parry off to the side as opposed to parry straight up and down. When someone is trying to throw a thrust straight into you, what you have to worry about, of course, is moving their blade side to side, rather than figuring out whether or not you're going to come down in a vertical enough position to land the hit. I think if Mark had thrown an edge down shield how here, he would have inevitably hit Duncan in the head, but he also probably would have been stabbed. So the flat shield how here was a great choice. And you can see again like why the biomechanics of this flat shield how works so well. The bind that they engage in right when the swords meet is one in which Duncan is pushing his hands down and forward, which is enough to kind of dominate the overbind position and put a lot of force into the bind that Duncan is trying to make as well. At the exact same time, Duncan has a choice where he can either try to wind up to defend himself, knowing that his tip will no longer be online, or just try to drive it through and hopefully hit something. Both cases being not so great as far as decisions go. So what ends up happening is exactly what happens 90% of the time. Mark's thrust goes straight through, bends nicely on the chest, while Duncan's just gets pushed ever so slightly off to the side, but more than enough to skip off and completely miss. Next up, we have an actual kind of repeat of the previous play. Mark walks forward, throws that same flat shield how, only this time it doesn't appear to land. Looking at the slow-mo footage, there is a moment where the blade is bent and it looks like it might have made contact, but one thing you have to remember is that our blades are very flexible and that when you throw a flat shield how, you are going to get that blade regardless of whether or not the tip touches anything anyway. So for the sake of argument, I'm just going to say that that initial attack did not land. At which point, Duncan pushes it off and over to his right side, and Mark does a very smart thing and engages in a very, very strong overbind. Now, the mechanics of this are not something that I've really talked about much before, because it's more or less along the lines of old school kinds of fencing. And it has its strengths and weaknesses. The strength, of course, is that when you engage on a left to right bind and your opponent is on their right side and they're right-handed, they're kind of in this like dangling position where they have no real strength and no real ability to attack. And it's a great position to put somebody in when you're going to grapple. The problem and the weakness here is that eventually you have to pull off of this overbind, and the second you do, well, your opponent's going to do the exact same thing. So Mark does something really smart here, which is after he engages in this heavy overbind, he's forced his opponent backwards. He releases the bind, and knowing that his opponent is immediately going to try to throw an attack on the other side, he simply rides that line and goes into a hanging parry on his right side. Now, the reason this works is that when you're on top of somebody's blade, and then you kind of stay on top of them while circling their head, you end up underneath of the blade. And this is actually a very good thing, because when you're trying to parry something in these hanging positions, being the first to be underneath of the sword is really the only thing that matters in terms of getting that block off. If Duncan's sword was underneath and he attempted to pull off and do the same parry, Duncan's sword would have still been underneath when he attempted to throw his cut, which means the hanging parry would not have been in the way. So it's a really good execution of what I would say, again, is an old school kind of technique. And the reason that you don't necessarily see it so much anymore is because, one, once you get into that overbind position, it's pretty good to then transition to a full-on grapple because you can maintain that position while freeing up your sword arm, but also because Duncan here made a little bit of a mistake in that when he pulled off to throw his follow-up cut, he came all the way around and threw a long edge cut. And one of the things he could have done is pulled off and immediately tried to throw a short edge Zwerkow underneath of the hanging parry. The reason that works is because it takes a much shorter path and tries to get underneath of the dominant position that that dominant overbind had previously. Basically, it shortcuts it so fast that you end up reaching your opponent's hands before they can get all the way into their hanging parry position, which means now you are the one throwing an attack while your opponent is trying to defend, and now you're the one in the overbind or underbind position where they can't really do anything about it. Unfortunately, though, that doesn't actually work out for Duncan. He throws his cut. Mark's hanging parry proceeds to block that follow-up cut, and he comes back around with a very spicy follow-up, come all the way around, hanging parry to Oberhau cut pattern. Again, something you used to see all the time and something you don't necessarily see anymore because it is sometimes very, very difficult to, or very, very easy to get stuck in this loop where you're constantly just hanging parry and cutting, hanging parry and cutting back and forth over and over and over again and just seeing who can do it faster. But for what it's worth, it worked out really great here and it got Mark another couple points. Next up, we have another application of this kind of Schielhau versus left plow thrust, only this time Mark does not throw the flat Schielhau, instead trying to win center with a left plow thrust of his own. And we can see the real differences play out here in terms of why that flat Schielhau is such a much better option, whereas just going left plow to left plow and having a little jousting match can sometimes turn out very poorly. In this particular case, because Mark is trying to throw a flat thrust and is trying to wind out his opponent, the winner of a left plow versus left plow thrust contest is the one who winds the best and the fastest. In this case, it was Duncan. You can see from the slow-mo here that as Mark is coming forward, he's really just extending his arms forward and raising them to the level of his shoulders, whereas Duncan is raising them past the level of his shoulders, meaning that as he raised his blade higher, he got the strong of his blade further up into the weak of Mark's, which means that he got the superior bind, he got the ability to push his opponent's blade out of the way, and he got the thrust. Next up, we have a repeat of something I had actually mentioned earlier. We see both fencers standing in their left plows again, coming in and out of range, at which point Duncan throws another low hand cut, which this time was edge on. And again, it's unclear from the footage whether or not this landed, but it almost seems like Duncan thought that it did. And the reason I say that is because immediately after throwing this undercut, he just pauses. He pauses and backs up out of range, which is typically what somebody does when they think they've ended the exchange. At which point, Mark seizes this opportunity to couch his sword again onto his right shoulder and throw a big left cut. And again, we see this hanging parry from Duncan. Now, the camera angle is different this time, and I can't really see visually whether or not it was far enough over. But what I can see is that when Mark throws this cut, it does appear to make it around and hit Duncan in the head. And I can only anticipate that the reason this was able to happen was because Duncan once again put up a hanging parry that didn't quite close off the entire quadrant. As a result, when Mark, who was stepping directly forward, and Duncan, who was stepping to his left, was able to get enough of an angle to kind of go around that parry and hit Duncan in the head. At which point we have another situation where it appears that Mark thinks that he landed that hit and almost stops for a second. So now both Duncan and Mark think that they've done something that counts and are just kind of backing away from each other. And meanwhile, the directors and the judges haven't said stop yet. Now, it's Mark's turn to kind of seize this opportunity and start throwing some more attacks. And unfortunately, we're completely off the camera angle this time because both of the fencers were basically out of the ring already. So the directors call a halt and they tally up the points, whatever they think they saw. But what I want to point out here is that we have a repeat of an interaction that we saw earlier in another instance of where, one, it's always so very important to know that when you're holding a defensive position that it covers 100% of everything it needs to cover. If it doesn't, you're going to end up in a situation like this where you rely so heavily on your parry that you just throw it up there, and then when you get hit anyway, not only are you getting hit, but you're very likely to freeze. And also, as something I've said before, in any exchange where you think you've landed something, don't stop. Always go to that one little afterblow later, because you never know when the judges are going to miss something that you might think is obvious, but upon request doesn't actually look that great at all. For our next exchange, we have yet another interaction between the flat Schielhau and the left plow thrust, once again demonstrating that if you throw a flat Schielhau against a left plow thrust, you are probably going to get the better of that situation probably 8 times out of 10. And again, we see exactly why. As Mark comes forward, he flicks his tip down. The flexibility of the blade naturally kind of curves it over the top of the guard, which may or may not be very historical, but it certainly does work with a flexible fetter, at which point it kind of gets stuck briefly in the shoulder of Duncan before flicking off. But the more important factor here is that left plow thrust from Duncan, despite the fact that he sunk his hips, despite the fact that he moved his head to his right side, despite the fact that he got his hands oh so very high to try to make sure that point couldn't get over his guard, still was not enough to land his own thrust. And this really just goes to show you why it is so dominant to throw these flat shield house against people in left plow. It gives you all the mechanical and angle-based advantages while making it so very difficult for someone who doesn't do the same thing to recoup those losses. So once again, we have a very clean thrust from Mark and nothing from Duncan. For our last exchange, we have a little bit of a spicy one. Mark comes forward, he throws a feinted high cut. Duncan goes up, parries it quite nicely, unfortunately puts just a little bit too much effort into that parry, because after all, Mark's attack was a feint, and what he is doing is he is cutting high on his right side, pulling off very quickly, and then throwing a high left Zverkow. And this is something that I do all the time, though normally from a defensive position, not an aggressive one, and it works very well, because a lot of people, when they see you come forward with that initial attack, expect a big, heavy bind. And what happens is that they put up a big, heavy parry. And what happens, of course, in that interaction is that when you throw up a big, heavy parry and there's nothing to interact with, you end up pushing your sword further off to the side than you really meant to. Of course, the left Zverkow is a perfect follow-up to the situation, because if I have pushed my sword too far to my left, that left Zverkow from my opponent is going to come right in on the right side of my head. Or perhaps, in this case, a little bit too far to the right side of the head. So I'm going to get up on the back of the head hit soapbox a little bit here and point out that once again we have an interaction where a perfectly normal and perfectly reasonable left Zverkow that didn't really do anything to change the angle. Mark didn't walk any distance to his left. He didn't use any offline movement. Duncan didn't really use any offline movement. So why did this left Zverkow hit the back of the head, or at least very deep into the side of the head? And the answer is that that's just what it does. In my opinion, it is really getting to the point now where these back of the head hits almost become an inevitability in this specific interaction. But on top of that, I want to kind of point out here that one of the reasons that Duncan did get hit, what looks kind of hard, towards the back of the head, is because he didn't do the back parry. If you remember this interaction from some of my previous videos, what happens all the time is exactly what you're seeing here. You push too hard on one side, and now you know you're about to get hit on your right side. So what do? You throw, as I stated earlier, the counter low right Zverk. And the reason you do it is because A, it gives you a decent chance of racing your opponent's Zverkow to the punch, at which point when you land and make contact, you're now in a right hanging parry. And that right hanging parry, coupled with the fact that someone is moving a little bit offline, whether they really mean to or not, to the left, and you're now throwing a right Zverkow, which means your hands are up and over the top of your head to your right, results in a situation where you end up guarding this exact spot where you would get hit, the back of the head. So you do the back parry, and you save yourself from what would have been a pretty rough hit. But when you throw this right Zverkow, and you throw it low, and you put your arms over the top of your head, you can't really help but turn your head a little bit, which means that rather than getting hit, maybe in the quarter panel back here on the side of the neck, you end up turning it ever so slightly more and maybe getting hit fully on the back. Is that your fault? Yes, it is your fault. You turned your head. But in this particular case, I don't really see how turning it would have, and going for the back parry, even if unsuccessful, would have resulted in anything worse. At the end of the day, Duncan still got hit in the back of the head, and it clearly hurt. What are you going to do about it? This interaction just seems almost inevitable. So if your choice is between throwing that Hail Mary back parry, hopefully getting it off, and maybe even staying safe and not getting hit at all, or just accepting that you're going to get hit on the right side of your neck and hoping that your opponent doesn't have a superior angle due to something that you did 2 seconds earlier and actually manages to wrap around and hit you in the back of the head anyway, it seems an obvious choice to me. But that's not what this video is really supposed to be about. At the end of the day, Mark won his fight. It was pretty well. off, I would say, and demonstrated quite a lot of interesting techniques and applications. But if you think I am wrong, go ahead and say so in the comments, and I'm going to be reviewing the bronze medal match from this tournament later this week.